Val is a comedian, actor, writer, and musician who has appeared on programs for CBC, MTV, and YTV. She's also headlined stand-up comedy shows all over North America. A graduate of Second City's Conservatory program, Val's also performed with the improv troupe Starwipe for 8 years. Val is set to co-headline Just for Laughs Toronto with Allie Pearse in the fall, has just finished filming a reality show for OutTV, and has been performing non-stop during Pride. Val combined coming out as transgender during the pandemic with her sudden emergence as a force in Canadian comedy. She spoke with me about how, as a comedic performer, one of the first things she's driven to address is the legibility of her gender non-conforming identity. She does this with a terrific sense of timing and also through her great command of physicality, a thing that not all stand-up comedians have. We also talked about the sense of responsibility she has to bring joy through humor. This is of course common among comics, but perhaps not as common as we might think. Her goal is not only to break the tension, but also to remind audiences that they don't need to decide what is, quote, morally okay to laugh at, and that there's no need for pity or coddling, affective states that are antithetical to a good comedy show and certainly not conducive to recognizing transgender as a legitimate social identity. It was really interesting to get a sense from Al of how the industry of comedy works in Canada. It's a competitive market, and one where comedians don't really receive much or any support. For this reason, she says she's had to build a career mostly on her own. Working independently means that, as she puts it, your attention is being pulled in so many different directions at once. There can and should be more support for the art of stand-up comedy in Canada, and so we address the kinds of organizing and lobbying that's happening around this issue, which has only been exacerbated by the ongoing coronavirus pandemic. The conversation really zeroes in on the question of how comedy works and the place of vulnerability and authenticity in it. This is especially relevant to Val's brand of comedy. Comedy is, from her perspective, easier when it's honest, and this is in spite of the fact that there's a degree to which when you perform, you're always, quote, submitting yourself to judgment as an entertainer. That relationship between humor and truth is maybe an especially salient feature of today's comedy, when you think about the ways that it's emerged as a confessional, intimate, immediate art form in the last 5 years. The way Al puts it, it's about packaging both trauma and insight into joke form to both disguise it and inspire people to think and reflect on a thesis for a while. A central part of her comedy right now is working through the question of what constitutes gender. In the words of Tay Meadow, quote, "Gender subjectivity is tender ground. It shifts beneath our feet, eludes easy capture, and impinges on emotional nerves. Sometimes we find ourselves seeking recognition in the most unlikely places. Even when handled with care, it is treacherous territory." We're seeing this throughout society right now, as greater support for transgendered folks is also provoking a regressive conservative backlash against gender nonconformity. I found it really striking that for Val, the focus is on making sure that with positive trans representation, we make transphobic jokes and rearguard politics a relic of the past. She says that she just has a nonchalant, indifferent, blind trust that we will look back in 10 years and know that the backlash was the last gasp of a hostile, uncaring attitude that has no place in society. It's wonderful to be able to chat with you. I'm a big fan of yours. I kind of, like a lot of people, am in awe of people who can perform comedy. I think part of that comes from the kind of confidence it seems to require. And that's certainly something that you project on stage, is this confidence. But like at the same time that you project that, you talk in your CBC Gems special, the 10 minutes you filmed for the new way of comedy, about how comedy in some ways is about finding a source of validation. But basically it's like when you come out with so much confidence, like you do in your JFL routine, for example, and you like stalk the stage, and there's this physicality. Like I feel it sometimes as a teacher that sometimes you're just not ready to give that level of like energy, and then like in the moment you kind of just have to summon it. Do you like is that about partly fighting for you this like tension between just being a person and then having to be a performer, right? Like a person that maybe has degrees of nihilism that doesn't come naturally to confidence and so on, and then just like having to turn it on just like that. How do you do that? I guess is in some ways the question.
It is very much a fake it till you make it kind of thing. Um, that like every joke is an opportunity to launch yourself courageously into the hope that it's going to pay off.
Hmm.
And so underneath the bravado of being on stage, there is that desperate human need for validation, and the best way to earn it is by feigning confidence on stage. You have to really uh, at least portray the image that you believe enough in these jokes that everything will work out. And so every joke is pretty much this leap of faith that uh, that the audience will like it. And I mean, of course, it's a rehearsed thing. Like the more polished the
Hmm.
material is, the easier it is to summon that confidence. But I won't lie, there is still that tiny distant fear in the back of my mind that every joke I'm about to say is not going to work, and I'm going to be completely abandoned by this audience and exposed for the fraud that I am deep down. You know?
Mm. I mean, I think a lot about Maria Bamford, who's one of my favorite stand-up comedians, and like, there was a series called The Comedians of Comedy a while ago where she's on the road with like Patton Oswalt and Zach Galifianakis, these kind of uber confident comedians in some ways who can, combine polished material with kind of riffing in ways that seem effortless, but that are actually like highly practiced and also partly come from like the identities that they inhabit. Whereas Bamford is a person who struggles openly with like mental illness, is an advocate in those ways. So I mean, like, this is what fascinates me is sort of like the psychology of comedy in some weird way, and that's why like I'm curious about how you experience the weight of having to cultivate a persona in comedy. Like you've had this lengthy career, like a decade and a half in comedy, but I wonder, if you're at a point where looking forward your comedy is actively like trying to narrate the journey, as you've put it, of trying to be a lady to the best of your ability, and how you work toward self-realization in comedy without like buying into the norms that constrain both comedy and gender. You're super articulate in your tight pants set on YouTube, where you talk about how your 4 and 5 year old niece and nephew responded to you coming out. You say that their intellectual universe is always collapsing and kind of rebuilding. And what's great about that story is that you're also reflecting on how, when they dismissed the magnitude of you coming out, it made you feel kind of self conscious and in need of more validation. And so, like, they're shrugging it off because they don't have a sense of the full social importance of gender identity yet. This thing that we as adults imbue with so much significance.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so, like, while embodying the gender that fits your sense of who you are is clearly a source of joy, you call it gender euphoria, which is such a beautiful phrase. Um, there's also value in being just like free of any judgment, being like a tabula rasa or whatever. So was that like refreshing on some level, getting that reaction? And how are you like sort of thinking through persona and cultivating it in comedy and its relationship to this journey that you're on, basically?
Wow. These are great questions, Scott. I find that my journey is I'm trying to align my onstage quote unquote persona with who I am as a person. I think the more authentic your act is to who you are, um, the better it will resonate with people, and just the funnier it'll be because it's honest. And I think stand up is really this extension of my lifelong uh, need to understand myself,
Mm-hmm.
and and so my act is really honestly a bit self-indulgent in its therapy. You're witnessing me process the changes that I'm going through in front of your eyes,
Mm-hmm.
and it's not easy in some ways giving myself up to submitting myself to that judgment, but uh, kind of paradoxically, it's it's always easier if you're just being honest, and it's always easier to write material and to convey it when it's always from the heart, when it comes from a very real place.
Yeah, and that radical honesty is something that definitely comes through in your comedy. And like, so you've talked about how you see a trend that you're not trying to like piggyback on that trend, but it's just like run parallel with your commitment to that sort of honesty. And the trend is one that kind of makes room for tragedy and trauma being a part of comedy rather than just like being actively excluded from it, guarded against it. And like, so it's amazing in some ways that you have like Hannah Gatsby's Nanette now as a watershed moment, Gerard Carmichael's Rathaniel. And I guess I wondered if you could talk about the work you're doing right now, the comedy you're preparing for this album you're recording in the fall, the performance you're doing for Pride Month, all of these things where, you're trying to find that balance between like earnest emotion and silliness. I listened to you, for example, talk about the Drag Heels show on your podcast and how like you're trying to figure out what to share, what to protect, what to keep sacred and what to keep secret, and moving away from like the shield of jokes, as you put it.
Um, so the drag heels experience was uh, different from very different from my stand up in that it was a little bit more heartbreaking, a little bit more. It was more vulnerability without the relief of a punchline at the end.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I still cut the tension with some jokes here and there, as is just my nature, and I can't help it. But um, it digs into a little bit more of a raw, desperate place.
Mm-hmm.
And basically, my piece, the performance that Drag Heels culminates in, it was about my inner critic and basically the very cruel way that I am constantly talking to myself.
Yeah, you call it
And
the Inner Heckler
yeah,
on your
the
podcast.
yeah, the
Yeah,
inner heckler. Yeah, that's what I called it in the piece too. To
right.
like connect it to my world of stand up, you know? I find that with stand up, I think the audience goes in with the expectation that the tension will be relieved. They just trust that whatever tension you build as a comedian will always have some kind of catharsis. And um, with this drag heels, the catharsis wasn't so much a joke; it was sort of a serious realization
Mm-hmm.
without the release of a punchline. So I think in that sense, it feels a little bit more memorable and substantial. It gives you a little bit more to think about because I feel like, joke packaging trauma and insight into joke form almost disguises it in a way.
Mm-hmm.
Like an effective joke will make people think and reflect and on I guess your thesis on the point of it for a long time afterwards. But I think when the message is delivered without the fluff of a punchline, uh, I think it has more longevity to chew on
Mm-hmm.
intellectually.
Yeah, I think it can be more moving. Like, I think about jokes in relationship to music a little bit, where like a joke is like a song. A song is a higher form of language in a certain way. It can operate on multiple registers all at once. So like hearing a weather station song is going to move you, but it's going to like stick with you in a way that might like your brain might come back to it, and you'll process it like later. Whereas if somebody is speaking to you directly, in that more serious register, it's like right off the bat, right? Unmediated almost. Then I think it's like it has the capacity to push in a different way. And so I like, from hearing how you've described your performance on the podcast. Is this supposed to just sound like podcast but like mispronounced? I'm not sure where.
It's the story is that my real name is Algis,
Right.
Algis, and so the running joke that I've always done my entire life is basically I describe my emotional physical states just adding gis at the end. So if I'm tired, I'm tired gis. If I'm so depressed that I just need to lay on the floor, I'm floor gis. I
Mm-hmm.
just add the last part of my name to whatever
Okay.
mental state I'm in. And so Podgis is my little tongue in cheek. This is my podcast with
Okay.
my
I
name on it.
But so, like, I'm super interested to see that come out. It's going to be on OutTV and Apple, from what I understand, like next year. So congrats on getting that sort of done, and I can't wait to see what comes out of it. And so it's interesting to me that you do have this style that is about kind of trying to embrace yourself and negotiate that, creating joy out of a shit situation, as you've called it. But I wanted to talk about like one of your like stated influences, which I don't know what kind of relationship you still have to like Dane Cook. um, but you talk about how the album Retaliation got you interested in stand up, and like there is a way in which like his physicality is like a little bit like yours. You have this JFL Just for Laughs set where you stalk the stage, jokingly intimidating the front row. In the CBC Gem set, there's this awesome moment where you're like flexing and saying, "Laugh, you didn't laugh." And I love those bits because it's just showing the embodied nature of stand up in this really funny way. And so like you're aware, as you've said, that Cook is a person that he's not like cool anymore. People don't like him necessarily. So you're like, sounds like you're a little self-conscious about stating him as an influence, but it is the case in a way that like the reason for that, I don't know if people remember this, is that, Cook was exposed for having allegedly stolen some jokes from Louis C.K. And I wanted to ask you about joke theft, basically, and like the politics of plagiarism in comedy specifically. Is it still the stigmatized thing that it was during that controversy? Do people lose their reputations over it, or do you think that the kind of intensification of what's called cancel culture has people paying attention to different kinds of problems in comedy?
um, Joke theft is, and I'm positive will always be, a cardinal sin in comedy.
Mm-hmm.
And basically, my just to be clear, my sort of self consciousness about naming Dane Cook as an influence
Mm-hmm.
has much less to do with the theft as a given. Like that's I mean that's very wrong. Don't steal jokes.
Mm-hmm.
But my I'm self-conscious about naming Dane Cook as an influence because of the way it makes people roll their eyes. I mean, I take full
Yeah.
ownership of it now, but for the longest time, after he got so famous, it was that slingshot effect where he was
Mm-hmm.
just too ubiquitous, and people just, it was cooler to hate him at that point. And so I just I kind of flinch at everything, the culture that he sort of reflected and represented at the time, like the frat boy, uh, just kind of inconsequential. Uh, Partying is really your only concern. It's sort of a lack of humanity.
Mm-hmm.
um, but
I get
I've
it. Yeah.
I've grown up, so like fuck you if you think it's stupid that I used to love Dane Cook, whatever, man.
Yeah.
Um, but on your point about joke theft, uh, I mean, yeah, just to reiterate, it's joke theft will always be a cardinal sin, and unfortunately, the current trend of the fact that it's just so easy on social media to uh, edit someone's tweet or joke or material, just literally plagiarize people's jokes on TikTok and pass them off as your
Mm-hmm.
own. Um, it's troubling, and it's very frustrating and saddening as a comedian to see that.
Yeah. It's your livelihood.
Yeah, absolutely.
You know?
So I mean, I thought that, not to invoke Louis C.K. too in this conversation, but I thought that the episode with Dane Cook and Louis, where they sat down
Yeah.
and discussed these accusations of joke theft, I thought they were both very honest about where how they saw the situation. Like Louis, I
Hmm.
think at one point says that Dane Cook is kind of this rocket ship with its own gravitational
Yeah,
thrust,
yeah.
its own pull, and so whether he means to or not, probably on a subconscious level, he just sort of uh, he's thinking on his feet so often that sometimes a thought that isn't exactly completely original to him will sort of slip in, and he's gonna riff on it. So
Hmm.
I thought that was an interesting take. I think joke theft isn't always so deliberate, and I do appreciate the idea that sometimes there's parallel thought in comedy, and you'll use a premise that maybe you don't even abundantly realize that you heard it somewhere else.
Hmm. There are experiences that perhaps are shared in just being
Yeah,
people with bodies.
totally.
You know, but at the same time, it is about the uniqueness of your take. And so, people are, or social media accounts like Fuck Jerry or whatever that are openly stealing jokes are really encroaching on people's ability to, have any success. So it's, yeah, I'm really interested in the politics of that. But I'm also interested in the politics of, trans identification and this sort of humor scandal that we're seeing emerge, where it seems like public sentiment and very public comedians are like increasingly at odds. So like Billy Eichner in his opening monologue for the standout LGBTQ plus celebration like Netflix special talks about the contemporary attack on trans people and jokes that he is not only talking about Florida, he's talking about Dave Chappelle's latest Netflix special. And there's this like big, he gets all these laughs, but it's like bitterly ironic that this is a joke being made on a Netflix special. And I wanted to ask you about like the current climate for trans comics and the kind of hostility that Eichner is addressing. I know that you've said in an interview that you don't presume to be woke at all. So if you don't really want to weigh in on this, I get it. I mean, you're living your life, and you don't have to necessarily weigh in as like a representative trailblazer. That stuff can be exhausting. But I did want to hear your thoughts on these popular comedians like Dave Chappelle and Ricky Gervais getting away with some of the most revolting forms of transphobic humor. I mean, how do you interpret the ways that Netflix has really stood behind Chappelle and Gervais? And do you think comics like you, younger, like progressive comics, are increasingly fed up with these big names and even the streamers who support them?
Um, hmm. My perspective on these things is probably disappointingly simple. It's that history will basically dictate in a decade or so how we're gonna look back on this. My perspective is basically that, like, in 10 years, I'm sure we're all gonna look back on all of this and shake our heads at just how regressive these comedy specials really truly are.
Mm-hmm.
And so I kind of just have this nonchalant, indifferent, blind trust that um with more trans representation, these these types of jokes are going to start being a relic of the past. And like, all I can do is just basically keep my head down and keep hustling, keep working, keep representing myself the way I do, and contributing an alternate voice to these rich fucking
Mm-hmm.
comedians who really truly have nothing to lose. Like, they'll
Yeah.
say that they're really putting themselves out there, but it's evident that there's no canceling them. They scream that they're getting canceled, and then get paid $25 million to do two fucking specials on Netflix. So
Yeah.
like, cry me a river, man.
Yeah. That's not what
Um,
cancellation looks like for sure.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
And so maybe this is just me quelling my cognitive dissonance, but I just trust that things will work out in the end. It's so silly in its simplicity, but I every time one of these scandals rises and falls, it's just, what can I do about it
Hmm.
but to represent myself? That's the best way to combat prejudice, is by educating people and just by showing up. So
Yeah.
that's kind of my intention.
I think that's kind of enlightening, actually. Like, because, the kind of echo chamber of endless hot takes isn't actually changing the zeitgeist necessarily. And I love this idea that, looking back on Gervais's most recent special, the hope is that it will not age well. Like, we talk about comedy aging well or poorly, um, you know, and I know you're a fan of like Monty Python. John Cleese is this guy who now has this show I think called Cancel Me, which is trying to like work against like cancel culture. So like these old guys who is obviously were incredibly impactful when it came to comedy, don't have all of like the answers, and we maybe shouldn't even look to them for the answers. And I guess that to me is like kind of enlightening to say there is comedy that we loved. Like I'm a fan of The Simpsons, right? You can look at supercuts of The Simpsons mocking LGBTQ plus people on YouTube, and like it's like an hour and a half long. These jokes strung together. It is the case that we can be influenced by something that then doesn't age well, and the two things can kind of coexist. Trying to reconcile them maybe is like a fool's errand a little bit. It's like it's hard to do that, right? So
Yeah.
I think you've got a great perspective on that, and one that is sort of It's empowering you to do what you feel you can, right? Which is educate people in a way, and build this degree of like solidarity through humor. And that kind of leads into my next question, which is about whether you think there is this progress being made in terms of actually like creating space for diverse voices in comedy. I mean, back when you identified as gender fluid, you talked about how you might not be the best person to answer this question, which I think gets asked a lot because at that time you could still choose to sometimes inhabit the identity of a white guy, as you put it. But there's a way in which now you're choosing to move away from the privilege of that position. Is there a sort of solidarity emerging among comics who break the mold, basically?
So I have to say, I've in the year plus in the past 2 years, I've enjoyed a lot of exposure and a lot of success. And so I feel, I mean, at this point, I feel like I'm confident enough that I can comment now.
Hmm.
But I do truly feel supported. And I don't know if that's particular to Toronto, the community in Toronto, or the community in Canada, or just the wider comedy community. Um, I think there is there is a demand for diversity in
Hmm.
voices in art and comedy, and I conveniently check a box. So I think that, I mean, market wise, if we're going to speak about it purely from a capitalistic, if that's a
Hmm.
word, sense of the word,
Hmm.
like there is, I can be a cash cow. I mean, tell that to my bank account. Uh, but where am I going with this? Essentially, I do feel accepted and welcomed into the community, and given
Hmm.
space to um to
Yeah.
exist. And I think in general, comedians are artists and will respect any other comedian who is either pushing the envelope or sort of discovering themselves and working on mastering the craft. And so this niche that I've built for myself, this brand, is particularly unique. And I think just the way the market works, people foster that.
Hmm.
I feel like um I think the times are changing, and again, I don't know if this is just a metropolitan Toronto type thing, but I really do feel like I've been celebrated,
Hmm. That's amazing. I
and
mean,
I think
yeah.
yeah,
Sorry, I don't mean to cut you off by any means.
yeah, and I think there is, just to put a cherry on that point.
Hmm.
I do think that marginalized groups are being celebrated and represented with increasing effectiveness.
Yeah. And I mean, like at the same time, it's clear that you have to hustle. Like this is just I just interviewed Janelle Niles, a Mi'kmaq comedian, and she talks about having to do a lot of this work herself. And I want to come back to that question in just a second, but like just in terms of the city you're in, on your podcast, not to get real, you've talked about actually being scared for your life living where you live. I noticed that you basically live streamed your walk home on Instagram recently, and I
Yeah.
wondered if that was just partly about feeling some level of protection from connection. And I mean, like you talk about feeling supported depending on the city, being publicly, a trans woman, and you contrast the feeling of pride with the feeling of fear, and how these are dependent, I think, on like the context you're in. When you're actually performing in different cities with different audiences, for example, like the new wave of stand-up uh, set, you talk at the end about how Vancouver is distinct, right? Do you have a tester, a joke that you use that when you tell it, right away whether you've kind of got the audience, you've got their support? And are there more specific cities in Canada or in the States that you feel are the most receptive to your specific brand of comedy?
Well, first of all, I mean, COVID has basically put the kibosh on me traveling to the States for the last little while,
Right.
and I'm
Hmm.
currently working on building a portfolio that'll allow me to work legally in the States. So
Yay.
yeah, yeah. So I
Hmm.
can't speak to America in particular, but um, yeah. So I haven't had the opportunity in the past 2 years to tour anywhere outside of the major cities in Canada. But I've been pretty safe, I guess you can say. But
Hmm.
I find that typically, I mean, just on site and upon hearing my voice introduce myself when I'm up there, I think people. Well, I'm clockable. People know that I'm trans immediately as I take the stage. So
Hmm.
there isn't really much of a tester. At, like,
Right.
people already kind of trust that I'm going to address the elephant in the room. And so I guess
Mm.
if I do, I mean, my opening joke lately has been I just come right out and say it. I'm like, "How was your lockdown? Anybody else change genders out of boredom? Just me?"
Yeah, yeah.
Um, and it's just my way of, yeah, addressing the elephant in the room directly
Hmm.
and immediately, just to break that sort of tension and to remind the audience that I'm not above laughing at myself, and they shouldn't feel like they have to coddle me or walk on eggshells deciding what is morally okay for them to laugh at, and where they should sympathize and pity me. You know, and
That's amazing. And do you find that's a requirement specifically maybe with, I know, you haven't had other maybe experiences outside of the country, but do you have a sense that that is a Canadian thing that people don't, because I'm just thinking about this context and how some comedians have talked about, especially comedians that are, BIPOC folks, speaking from a position of trauma is something that, especially like the white mainstream, as it were, the white cis hetero patriarchal mainstream in Canada, um, especially liberals, I guess, don't necessarily want to laugh at. So it's like more you're giving them license to laugh with you on some level, right? Like letting them in.
absolutely, yeah. It
Mm-hmm.
is, in effect, I'm giving them permission to laugh with me and
Mm-hmm.
reminding them that, it's a comedy show. You're not. I'm
Mm-hmm.
giving you permission to laugh at slash with everything that I'm about to say, and
Mm-hmm.
I think it's a great little message right off the top that, like, I'm gonna be honest.
Yeah.
Let's talk about what we're looking at here.
Oh my God. Yeah. Talking about, I mean, the jokes that you make in the tight pants set about like worrying that you're too, like buying into certain like norms around femininity, like being lost in a Home Depot. Like it's so funny. Like, can you break those jokes down in particular where you're like kind of like publicly worrying about how you're too overtly like conforming to feminine gender norms? Am I reading those jokes correctly? Am I
Yeah,
overreading those jokes? I don't know.
no, absolutely. I mean, one thing that I struggle with on or off stage just is basically what trying to tease apart the societal aspects of what constitutes gender, like
Mm,
clothing, the superficialities that we attribute to male and female, like clothing and hair and makeup. And I guess what I continue to struggle with is, you know, do I what makes me a woman? Is it the clothing? I do struggle with reflecting on what is it that qualifies me as a woman.
mhm.
And so I try to analyze that as much as I can in my act without getting too verbose and heady.
Yeah, yeah.
But but jokes like the Home Depot thing, playing up the whole damsel in distress at a Home Depot just so I can feel validated. I'm kind of mocking gender norms as well. It's sort of I feel, without patting myself on the back too hard, I feel like I am accomplishing a few things in
Mhm.
one fell swoop by talking about it. I am kind of mocking gender norms, um by exploring this transitional phase.
Mhm. I think this is the paradox of parody in a weird way, right? Because at the same time that it's you're parodying it as a comedian, you're occupying an identity in earnest, right?
Hmm.
And so like that has to be a really tricky balance. I think about your love of like what seems like hair metal and music that tends toward that kind of like, heavy rock, like you like Guns N' Roses and stuff. Like there's a way in which like there's this style of self expression that exists, the rocker, that has always been kind of androgynous, the long hair and everything, and the tight pants. And even as you like play guitar in your drag heels performance, you're not reducible to those categories. Like at the same time, I think. So this is what I think what you're exploring without, as you say, being too heady or preachy or didactic in your performance. Um, but I guess I wanted to come back to, unless you had comments around the rock and roll thing. Yeah, what's your relationship to guitar right now and that kind of aspect of your performance?
I've always thought there is nothing sexier to me than a badass front woman in a band holding a guitar,
Mm-hmm.
just rocking out. I just think rocker chicks are so powerful and so sexy. I think because there is this sort of masculine, almost phallic element to holding a guitar slung low. I don't know.
Sure.
I don't know if it's their way of sort of taking ownership of what feels like a more masculine presence, but accomplishing it with grace and femininity. I think it's just a powerful image.
I mean, St. Vincent comes to mind for sure. The way that St. Vincent can wear suits and at the same time thongs and these, like play with gender in these like really physical ways. Um, but yeah, I mean, let's maybe jump back to this question of just like the business of it a little bit, not to be crass, but
Sure,
um,
sure.
like on your podcast again, you talk about at one point how you need a team around you. That right now you're doing it all on your own, and it sounds like this is partly because you had this breakout year and you're getting more, you're getting exposure, you're getting work. Um, I wonder, if you do you think in part that surge that you've experienced since 2020 is just like it's about the pandemic and people needing humor more? Do you think that part of it is just figuring out who you are and moving away from what you've called this kind of broy identity? just like being more comfortable in your own skin? Was it more about figuring out specific things about the business of comedy, like being a smart entrepreneur? And like about that question of the having a team, I know this is a lot of questions all bundled into one, but like, do you think having a team would just like give you the time and energy to develop creatively? Does like all of the entrepreneurial work you have to do on top of the writing sap your strength basically?
Yeah, I think not only does it sap my strength, but I think that I still haven't quite perfected it. I think when your attention is being pulled in so many different directions, it's harder to be truly effective at any one thing. So that's why I feel like on the business end of things, in terms of staying organized and sending invoices and booking myself and negotiating pay and all
Mm-hmm.
the kind of more administrative elements of being an entertainer, the quote unquote job part of it.
Mm-hmm.
I it's unfortunate that in Canada there isn't a whole lot of there aren't any agencies that represent live performance and
Mm-hmm.
comedians. It's all on camera work.
Mm-hmm.
And so comedians really have to truly do it all on their own.
What about like funding? Because there's like so much government funding in Canada, but it seems to only really reward like traditional art forms, right?
Oh
Like it's
yeah.
humor. It's like, what is that? How do we give that a grant? The
There's
structure
this
doesn't
odd
support you.
Yeah, exactly. Sorry to interrupt. There's
No.
there's an odd there's always been this stigmatism against comedy as a form of art.
Mm-hmm.
I guess for some reason um because it's jokes and laughter and levity. I feel like it's got this little sibling relationship to to drama and visual art
Mm.
and stuff like that. That's why, what was it in the Oscars? Did they still put comedy and musical together as a category?
I don't know. You mean the Golden Globes, or
I don't know any of
I
the
think yeah, the
award
Golden Globes
shows.
they
I
do
don't.
that. They bundle them together, right?
Yeah, I
Yeah.
think, and so all this to say, I think it's sort of been changing. I mean, comedians in Canada unionized sort of 3 4 years ago,
Hmm.
and we have a group of comics working hard to sort of legitimize the art of stand-up comedy uh, with the government, so that
Hmm.
we can actually apply for grants, and that there'll be grants available for stand-up comics. So I do think the culture is changing, but it's been a long time coming, and we're not quite there yet.
Mm-hmm. It's like it's interesting. There's echoes of the ways in which, like, I'm also a fan of like actual comics, like comic books, graphic novels. That the history of that is really specific figures like Art Spiegelman, coming up with the term graphic novel, like literally changing the terms of the game in order to, as you say, like legitimate it and make it deserving of funding. But so much of it is just like performative in a way, and yet capitalism is the water we swim in. So it makes sense that in some ways like art is commodified, but I'm like heartened by the fact that at the same time that is obviously the case, that the structure still kind of works that way. That comics are, as you say, like unionizing. I'm super interested in that as just like a source of like collective power.
Hmm.
um but I did I asked you to look at this performance by Gerard Carmichael in Nathaniel, his HBO special, and like it's just to me, I saw lots of ways in which like that was resonating with what you were kind of trying to do in terms of narrating your journey. He's like exposing secrets as he frames it, right? And so you say in your incredible new wave of stand-up routine that it's kind of poetic, that you're recording the performance 2 years after coming out on stage as queer. And so this is what Carmichael is doing. He's coming out on stage as gay in Nathaniel. So he's like defying expectations, both in terms of going against the hypermasculine hetero way that a black man, he says, is expected to just be in the world, but he's also going against expectations of a comedian. Like there are long silences in that special.
Mhm.
Um, and it can there's this incredible catharsis at the end where he talks about freedom and personal growth, and there's this like so much applause and approval and support and care from the crowd. um, I'm wondering, after having watched Nathaniel, what your impressions were of the sort of vulnerability he shows there, and whether like you can imagine yourself, I don't know, creating similar kinds of art that expand the frame for people to like experiment to become who they want to be. Do you think comedy can, it obviously is in some ways, but do you think comedy has almost like a duty to do this sort of experimental work to make more room for folks?
That's a good question. I mean, I don't necessarily know if I like the word duty. I feel like comedy
Yeah, I wasn't sure about it.
doesn't. I feel like comedy maybe doesn't necessarily owe anyone anything
Hmm.
besides, I guess, a laugh if you want to be considered a comedian.
Hmm.
But I think um, the current trend to be a lot more vulnerable and to leave spaces without that release of a laugh, of a joke, of a punchline. I think um
It's a risk, but there's a reward to it, right?
yeah, absolutely. And I feel like it elevates comedy from being this frivolous endeavor to maybe a little bit more of a humanizing experience,
Hmm.
showing you who exists behind the jokester's mask, what
Mm.
what makes them really truly human. And I'm enjoying the demand for it. I think
Hmm.
this radical honesty trend isn't going away anytime soon.
Yeah, I mean, and it's validating, I think, in many ways. Like you've talked about how in your early days in your teens you felt kind of compelled to coincide with all these comments people were making around you, reading who you were and calling you like a lady killer and these kinds of like things. Carmichael is open in that special about that similar pressure to be masculine. I think like the obvious effect is that of this culture of like masculine socialization is that if you want to indulge in who you are and what you actually want, as you said, it becomes this like shameful act, and you have to like somehow either suppress it or overcome it. So there's all these really strong resonances between your stand-up and Carmichael's, especially in terms of, and I don't know if you want to get into this, how you speak openly about how your mothers really hurt you with their kind of closed-mindedness. I have to think that's really difficult to talk about, but at the same time has a real value within the public space of doing comedy, to help just process those experiences. In those moments where you're making those jokes and you're getting laughs, is it almost like the audience becomes your chosen family in a way?
The audience does become a chosen family in the sense that while they are judging while they are judging your effectiveness as a comedian and as an entertainer, I feel like the contract between the comedian and the audience, it feels, especially for me, it feels like we are entering into an intimate relationship,
Hmm.
where one in which I am opening my heart to this audience, and I'm trusting that they will handle it with care, sure. um so I do like the idea that the audience becomes this chosen family, especially because I got to be honest. I mean, I invest a lot of my self-esteem into how I'm doing on stage. Like
Hmm.
there is a need for this validation, and so the audience becomes this family that provides me my little ego hits and my self-esteem boosts. They are
Hmm.
they are a family that I've chosen and that I spend a lot of time with.
Hmm. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, for sure. I mean, and I think there's only like a handful of comedians who don't care if they bomb, right? Like there is almost a level of nihilism to that. If you are just, you go out to the judgment of an audience, as you put it, and then just disregard that there is a certain expectation. Norm Macdonald was sort of infamous apparently for just like never caring if he bombed. He might be, if you think about it, the most famous Canadian stand-up comedian ever. And yet, like, that is a defining characteristic of that guy, to just not care on any level, to almost savor it. And I think like that level of nihilism, like it too does not age well. Like there's something shocking about it. There's something amazing about it in a way. But I think the ways in which like certain comedians who clearly like loved Norm Macdonald and were deeply attached to him ignore the fact that in his most, the posthumous Netflix routine, that just came out, there are transphobic jokes in that routine, and clearly he says them without any concern for how they're going to land, what impact they're going to make. And that nihilism is bad. Like I feel like it's kind of indefensible, to be honest. Like, so caring about public sentiment, caring about this intimate relationship that you have to your audience is just more honest.
Yeah, well, I think that's a great point, and I've always been genuinely perplexed at some of the comedians I've overheard brag about the audience that they've walked, and walking is an industry term for, like, getting annoying or pissing audience members off so much that they get up and leave or ask for their money back. They just leave in the middle
Right.
of your set. And so I've always been so perplexed at comedians who brag about the audience members that they've walked, because not only does it kind of indicate that you bombed, that you failed your job, but it also indicates this um antagonism. Like,
Yeah.
why would you be proud of exploiting an audience's trust and care and attention just to abuse them? I just
Hmm.
don't, I can't wrap my head around that. And
Hmm.
so while I do respect a comedian like Norm's irreverence, I guess,
Hmm.
um his lack of any sort of fear of bombing, I think that is very respectable, and I wish I had a little bit more of that myself.
Hmm.
I do think that as a comedian, you do have a responsibility and a duty to respect your audience and to be
Hmm.
considerate of their time and money.
Sure.
you know?
And care. I mean, you obviously don't want just like maybe an echo chamber where you're just like feeding back into their expectations. Like I think comedy is great when it sort of tries to chafe against those norms and stuff. But at the same time, having such like uber confidence that you can like force an audience to vacate is not necessarily a point of pride.
Yeah.
I think there's got to be, and comedy treads in that kind of middle ground of hospitality and hostility in a weird way. um and yeah, so I mean, like, I wanted to, I guess, come back to the challenge of doing comedy during the pandemic, which it's not really over, but we're pretending it kind of is. And I guess, like, I'm wondering about, obviously, like how challenging it was to do comedy during the pandemic. I don't know if you want to talk about the, yeah, I mean, you're particularly good with Zoom comedy shows. I'll say that. Like, you're very engaging with the Zoom audience. You're like very present to it, which I have to think is difficult. But as we emerge from doing, or comedians emerge from doing Zoom shows, do you feel like you and others are trying to make up for lost time and, in a way, lost income? I mean, do you see other comics hustling in the same way? And is that hustling kind of, purely artistic, or is it mostly just like there's a financial impetus to get out and try and fill venues?
The way I kind of see it, I mean, the drive to hustle um is unchanged. I don't think the nature of it has changed at all. I think everyone's just eager and relieved to be back into the more or less normal swing of things.
Hmm.
And I think, um, speaking to Zoom shows in particular, my strategy has always been, I'm a firm believer in adaptation in comedy. And before I came out, I spent a lot of time on the road performing at really at venues that had no business running a comedy show. And when you do enough of those gigs, you learn how to adapt and how to make it work and how to improvise and how to point out where you're standing and what's on the walls and who you're talking to.
Mm-hmm.
And so that ability to roll with the punches and improvise really helped me out during the Zoom phase, because my Zoom act is basically very self-referential. I'm pointing at things in my room. I'm talking. I'm pointing out things in other people's
Yeah.
rooms. There, you know, you just have to stay honest and address what's going on around you.
Mm-hmm.
It makes no sense to ignore those kinds of things, and you really have to adapt. And so I would say that now that things are opening up again, it feels almost like business as usual, but with a bit more of a boom. Like, I'm speaking for Toronto, and I feel like in general we're enjoying a nice little comedy renaissance. I think stand-up comedy is growing in popularity. I'm seeing some new clubs pop up here in Toronto that are doing very well. And so I think the hustle will always remain the same. I think there isn't any sort of feeling of making up for lost time, at least not for me, because I've been writing pretty consistently and still performing, so it all just feels like business as usual personally.
That's a really interesting kind of inside view, right? Especially the fact that these new clubs are opening and stuff, like just giving, actual physical space, but also like what it's meant for you to like, yeah, have to adapt to these sometimes not very suitable spaces. That's really interesting. But I guess, in terms of making up this idea of making up for lost time, I wanted to talk about your like part of your JFL routine where you explain that at first people interpreted how you were performing and presenting as a form of drag, and you have all these great lines about how superficial and mean the drag community can be, ending with this line that you're just 3, as in 3 years old. Um, and I wanted to use this to basically ask about the relationship between, to be really academic about it, queerness and temporality. I teach this essay by Jodi Taylor called Queer Temporalities and the Significance of Music Scene Participation, where she says that, quote, queer lives often skip over some of the steps of the heteronormative timeline and skew the responsible progression towards maturity by favoring, often through just involvement in queer scene activities, a prolonged youthfulness and lingering within early adulthood. Basically, she argues that queer uses of time are different, that coming out and the time it takes after coming out to create new forms of relationality and new identities means that you're really starting anew. And I wonder, like, if you're thinking about that, if you're writing jokes or things that aren't jokes, right? Forms of art that focus on that aspect of the queer experience, this feeling of being like you are in a sense 3 years old.
Yeah, I that really resonates with me, the point that you're making about starting a new life. I mean, they literally call transitioning second puberty if you're taking hormones, because
Mm-hmm.
you have this pubescent, your body is going through changes. um you know Emotionally, you're going through this whole you're reliving puberty in a new gender. And so I totally get the desire to sort of reclaim the youth that you didn't get to have, like that awkward adolescent phase, enjoying it this time as what feels like your true self, what you never got to enjoy because you were protecting yourself, you were closeted, sure. And so, I mean, that really resonates with me, first of all.
Mm-hmm.
The idea that, these are my teens again, and my act really reflects that. I think it's really compelling to it to paint yourself as an underdog, in the sense that you're new to an experience. You're a fish out of water. You're clumsy. You're making mistakes all over, but you're learning. And I think people are really compelled by that underdog figure.
Yeah,
And
totally.
so a lot of my act is literally me just spelling out like, hey, I honestly don't know what I'm doing. I'm kind of figuring it out as I go along, this crazy transition thing. And these are the ways in which I'm clumsy and new and making all these beautiful, hilarious mistakes.
Mm-hmm.
And and so yeah, I think that uh that really resonates with people. And I I do totally agree. I love that point about just basically sort of not regressing wouldn't be the right word, but maybe Freud would call it regressing, like into a juvenile phase.
Yeah,
I
what did
get it.
Freud know?
Yeah, yeah, I know, right?
No, I like this idea of, beautiful, hilarious mistakes, as you put it, leaving more room for that sort of like failure and figuring it out and all that stuff is refreshing in comedy, which is, historically it has been about the kind of aggressive perspective of somebody who I guess does have it all figured out, or even if they're avowing their own complicity with like really shitty habits. Somebody like CK was kind of like, this is what his comedy was built around,
Hmm,
in
hmm.
a lot of ways. They're still like defiantly owning it. It's there's like a barrier, and so like moving away from that sort of masculine uh, persona in a way is it's cool. I mean, it's enlightening. It really does. There's something energetic and wonderful about it. And so you've joked that no one took you seriously until you slapped on a wig and a dress. But it's like you combine that with a specific communication style. You have this joke about like, you know, uh, I don't even know. I can't pull it off. But the Courtney Cox took up MMA joke,
Yeah.
right? Like that embodied queer nature of your performance. Like I wonder how you relate to, and it's weird that I'm asking this, the men in the audience in particular, right? Are you like constantly having to negotiate the specific sort of work of like creating conditions for men in the audience specifically to laugh? Is that a fair question?
Yeah, I do do my best to take my male audience members into consideration, but I do play a lot with that discomfort. And I
Mm,
think I I challenge it without being too antagonistic,
hmm.
and I challenge their discomfort in a more playful way. But I think um, what I'm basically trying to do is subvert and point out that feeling that they get, where like as heterosexual men, if they feel any sort of attraction to me, that let's name it,
Hmm.
because it would make me feel good. But I do take them into consideration, but I also want to challenge them
Hmm.
as well, and remind them that it's okay to be anything outside of heteronormative.
Right. Yeah, and especially generationally, I think like there's this notion, like apparently, just like there have been studies that now show that there's a like a more radical embrace of sort of like pansexuality, fluidity, all of these things among younger people. Like there's just it really is a generational thing that you can
Mm-hmm.
like track it. That men of a certain age are incredibly unnerved by feeling any sort of like non-normative forms of attraction or desire. And so like you calling it out, naming it in the way that you do, I see as potentially transformative, and I really love it. um,
I appreciate that, Scott.
yeah.
Thanks.
And thanks so much. I won't take any more of your time. You've been really generous with just coordinating this and letting me ask you these questions. They're they're maybe they were too prying at times. I apologize for that, but
No, not at
um
all.
yeah.
I could talk to you for hours. I find these questions, I got to say, very thoughtful, very insightful. I'm honored that you did all this research and you watched all this footage. My God, I'm sorry.
No, it was fun. Most of my interviews are pretty academic, but anytime I have an opportunity to speak to somebody who's doing the work of bringing joy, and yet also trying to provoke these sorts of, as I say, like actual transformations in people and publics, I'm excited to do it. So it's
Hmm.
my pleasure.
Can I also say one more thing
Of course.
to the last question? Um, Basically, what often crosses my mind uh, is that so many men are unfortunately closeted about their pansexuality or their sexual tastes. You know what I mean? Like
Mm.
transgender pornography is like one of the most popular categories. And my experience when I was in the closet was just there were a lot of married men, there were a lot of uh guys sneaking around on girlfriends, these tragically closeted people all over. I feel this desire to chip away at the shame, the culture of being closeted. I
Hmm.
want to contribute some kind of humanity to combat the idea that these men are their tastes in trans women are shameful,
Hmm. Absolutely.
because I've been a victim of it, and I think too many people are victims of it. So I kind of hope that in effect, when I take the stage and I, whatever, jokingly, flippantly mock dudes for their weird boners, I mean, I'll be a little bit more responsible and sophisticated with it, because even just saying it out loud right now makes me feel a bit gross and juvenile. But I just,
But it grabs
you
attention,
know,
right? That kind of the
yeah,
grossness of it, as it were, the grotesque, the carnivalesque. Like these are the things that grab people's attention. It's like you don't necessarily want to be Captain Holt on Brooklyn Nine-Nine calling a dick pic a digital phallus portrait. Like use the words that are used, as you say, name it, right? Like, and we shouldn't be
yeah,
scared
yeah.
of the names of the words either, in the ways that we always are.
Absolutely.
So I mean, like, I think there's so much value in the sort of liberatory stuff you're doing, and I do hope that the sort of prophecy is true. That looking back, so much of the comedy that is scandalous today and yet supported by these streamers is seen as utterly dated and hurtful and regressive in the ways that like it clearly is. People understand that it doesn't help chip away, as you say, at the shame that people experience to reproduce that kind of hateful stuff, you know?
Totally.
Um,
And my strategy is just to be as visible as I can. I feel like debating it and discussing it feels a bit exhausting at times for me, so I feel like the best way to combat prejudice is by being visible and portraying a humanity. Like I'm more than just my traumas, and I'm more than just the sob stories of the way society treats me. Like I have my triumphs and my struggles alike, and I'm just as human as anybody else. So I feel like the best way to combat that prejudice is by being as visibly human as I possibly can. That's really and truly my only goal.
well, and thanks for putting all your energy into it. I hope you have a team around you soon that can help you with it. um, and yeah, good luck with everything.
Thank you, Scott. I really appreciate this. This was a pleasure.